Last year, I found myself listening to Hadestown for the first time alone in my room on a brutalist university campus, emptied out by COVID. I was on this bleak, empty campus studying social psychology. These experiences, isolation, studying social psychology, and listening to Hadestown, combined in a reaction like crystallization, and made me realize all the way down to my core just how weak we are alone and how strong we can be together. To quote Hadestown, "Every coward seems courageous in the safety of a crowd. Bravery can be contagious when the band is playing loud. Nothing makes a man so bold as a woman's smile and a hand to hold. But all alone his blood runs thin, and doubt comes in." I should mention that I'm trying to have extracts of the music wherever possible, but that section kept getting copyright claimed, so I had to say it instead of having the music, and I've had to speed up some of the extracts. I'm going to put a version with the music in it better up on my Patreon for patrons to see, so that's an extra incentive to go check that out. Anyway, Hadestown is actually a really good artistic illustration of some social psychology phenomena, so I'm going to reference it throughout the video. You don't have to have seen or heard it for this video to make sense, but I recommend you check it out at some point, and I'll put a link below where you can hear it all for free right here on YouTube. There'll also be some spoilers, but most of those are really spoilers for a myth that is thousands of years old. When I told him about the concept for this video, my husband said,
"It's like apes together strong."
And I said, exactly, it's exactly like that. We are not that different from apes, we're evolved to be social creatures like apes, and we're stronger together. I hinted at before, but the other thing that made me feel the need to make this video is COVID. Yeah, this video has been a long time coming. If this video is a plant, Hadestown gave it water, but the seed for me came even before I ever heard Hadestown. On March 15th, 2020, a date that seems a world away, a professor of mine, along with one of his colleagues, put out an article called
"Don't Personalize, Collectivise."
In this article, they wrote,
"The common sense assumption, which is reflected in the advice being handed out to the public, is that the way to change behavior is to appeal to individual interests. To make sure people take notice, personalize the message. Change your behavior so that you will survive. Surely that makes sense." Well, no, it is precisely the wrong thing to do. Here's why. At a practical level, those least at risk, young, fit, healthy, may well feel it isn't worthwhile to make the necessary changes, and so continue acting in ways that put the most vulnerable, old and infirm, at risk of infection. Additionally, at a moral level, we have the right to disregard dangers to ourselves, and some even glory in being risk takers. They might be foolish, but it isn't disreputable to ignore safety advice. It is precisely when people stop thinking in terms of I and start thinking in terms of we, more technically when they develop a sense of shared social identity, that they start to coordinate, support each other, and ensure that the neediest get the greatest help. Sometimes this sense of shared identity emerges by the very fact of experiencing a common threat. But messaging also matters. When a threat is framed in group rather than individual terms, the public response is more robust and more effective.
The article closes with the phrase,
"We have to collectivize or we die."
Those words have such a sad echo now, don't they? So many fell into the trap of individualizing the pandemic, and so many of us died. Every time for the past 2 years, when I've been told to do what I am comfortable with and to be smart and protect myself, I think back to this article. After all, I am young and fairly healthy. I would be unlikely to die of COVID. I just want to do what's best for my community. But a lot of the time, the issue is phrased so individualistically that I can't even figure out what the best thing for my community is. I have been thinking a lot about the dangers of hyper-individualization and the goodness that can be found in groups, to the point where I felt like I had to make a video about it. I promise the video won't be all or even mostly about COVID. I just needed you to understand how I got here. By the way, if you're new, welcome. This is Political-psych-abby. I'm Abby. This channel is about the psychology of politics, and I tend to throw in a few jokes. I promise this won't all be as dark as that opening bit. I think it's important to acknowledge the role psychology itself has played in the demonization of groups, especially crowds. One of the main historical roots of the psychology of groups is Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd, a study of the popular mind originally published in 1895. If you'll direct your eyes to the screen, you'll see a series of covers from this book, all very unflattering to the concept of the crowd. This book has a less than positive view of crowds, especially politically radical, left-wing, and lower-class ones. Le Bon witnessed the Paris Commune firsthand, and let's just say he was not a fan. He identified strongly with the elite and was a nationalist and fervent anti-socialist and at least kinda racist, and also sexist. He even advised right-wing governments on how to use crowds to counter radicals and promote right-wing interests. So while Le Bon certainly believed in the power of crowds, he did not think very highly of them or the people they contained. He believed crowds make people irrational, violent, and mindless. He also believed that crowds erase individual identity via a process called submergence. The submergence thing actually has an interesting relationship to Hadestown. In Hadestown, Hades' workers lose their identities and even their faces. Arguably, this is loss of identity in a crowd, but clearly this loss of identity is because they lose themselves to their work and lose their ability to connect with each other. Their facelessness is always in terms of not being able to be seen by others and not in terms of not being able to recognize themselves. You can see this in the lyrics.
Why do we turn away when our brother is bleeding? Oh, keep your head. Why do we build a wall and then call it freedom? Oh, keep your head. If we're free, tell me why I can't look in my brother's eye.
It is a bit unclear if they lose their identities because they cannot connect to each other or if they lose connectedness because they lose their identities. It is probably a bit of both. Both these possibilities have parallels in social psychology. Social psychology has come a long way since Le Bon, and now the common and most scientifically supported view is that groups and crowds shape the identities of individuals, but they are also shaped by those identities and can magnify them, and that crowds can stand for the interests of those within them. Le Bon's view did not go unchallenged even early on, but it was highly influential. This led to many pathologizing the act of gathering in crowds to advocate for collective interests. It is also important to note that social psychology is mostly rooted in trying to explain bad group behavior, not trying to explain good group behavior. The 1930s and 40s were boom years for social psychology. As you can guess, that's not because those were great years for humanity. Like, these are the Wikipedia image collages for those decades. They do not look fun. Living through the world wars and then under the specter of nuclear annihilation really gave social psychologists a sense of urgency. Since this time was so pivotal to the field, negative views of group behavior became very common, if not the default. Honestly, we should not blame the scientists of this time for this. They were right that groups have the power to do awful things, and the negative potential of groups should be studied. In addition, we should keep in mind that many of these scientists had seen war firsthand and/or suffered at the hands of authoritarian regimes like the Nazis. Personal experience often informs scientific research, especially in terms of what gets studied. As long as we have a wide variety of personal experiences present in the field, there is nothing wrong with that in my view. And even if there is something wrong with that, there's not exactly much we can do about it. A pretty good indication of the influence of this time and attitude is the fact that the illustration on the cover of one of my textbooks is Guernica, a Picasso painting portraying a horrifying bombing carried out by the Nazis and Italian fascists on the orders of Franco during the Spanish Civil War in 1937. And no, I don't know why they printed the painting backwards on the cover of this textbook. Comment with your possible reason. I was talking before about how many of those who documented and theorized about groups were elites who looked down on crowds. However, I have to say that especially in the mid-20th century, many of those writing and theorizing about social psychology had themselves suffered at the hands of groups or seen those they loved suffer. For example, Stanley Milgram was profoundly shaped by interactions with his Holocaust survivor relatives. It is likely that these experiences led to his interest in studying obedience to authority in the context of atrocities. Still, almost all this time, there has been an often quieter and less dramatic discussion of the positive effects of groups. For example, as early as 1898, Triplett was doing research that determined people do certain tasks better as parts of groups. I think the really important thing to understand is that more than being intrinsically good or evil, what groups are is powerful. And this power does not negate the power or identity of those in the group, but rather shapes and sometimes magnifies it. Basically, what this video is going to argue is that groups are a powerful tool for change, and if you think change needs to happen, you probably need a group for that. One of the prevailing theories for understanding groups and movements is called social identity theory. Basically, this theory posits that people have identities associated with groups they belong to. People generally want good status for the groups they are members of. If they see the status of their group as bad or lesser than other groups, they have two choices: social mobility and social change. A social mobility belief structure hinges on the idea that social barriers are permeable, like you can pass through them, and that you can decouple your fate from the fate of your group. Social mobility for individuals is possible, but it is often positioned as more possible than it really is as a way of discouraging collective action. I will get much more into that later. A social change belief structure is predicated on the idea that social barriers are not permeable for an individual or have a very low amount of permeability. A social change belief structure often leads to social creativity. Social creativity is an attempt to redefine a group identity so that people can essentially feel better about themselves. This can, unfortunately, include comparisons with groups of equal or lesser standing, and these comparisons are often encouraged by dominant groups as a way of discouraging challenges to the status quo. What this is a divide and conquer strategy. When you add a belief that the status quo is unjust to a social change ideology, you get cognitive alternatives and social competition. Cognitive alternatives are a roadmap for social change and an ideology critical of the status quo. Social competition is competition with another group over status. This can be anything from a debate to a protest to an all-out war. I should mention that a lower status group engaging in successful social competition with a dominant group won't necessarily make life worse for members of the dominant group. It would just take away a portion of that dominant group's dominance. Like, women getting the vote did not make the world worse for men. It just took away a portion of their dominance over women. If you happen to think women voting was a bad thing for men, I suggest you leave now, because I am successfully stealing your masculine potency with my Jewess magic. And if you stay any longer, I will take more of it. You have been warned! Anyway, back to social psychology. One really important element of this is that separating someone from a group is a way to severely limit their ability to change the system. Making them believe in social mobility really strongly, basically if they leave behind collective identity they can make it on their own, is a really effective way to do that. Perhaps the most obvious example here is economic. If someone believes that they'll be rich someday, they are less likely to advocate for an equality-oriented society. Or get out the guillotines. I would like to assert that I am for the former, but do not currently favor the latter. What is sort of odd is that these beliefs about social mobility tend to translate into abstract beliefs about society rather than support for specific policies. For example, a study across 5 countries found that belief in social mobility was largely unrelated from views on estate taxes. Although I will say that a lot of people just don't have strong opinions on or understanding of things like estate tax. This same study also examined specific income inequality policies, like increasing taxes on top earners, and found that while lower social mobility beliefs correlated with the support for specific income tax policies, this pattern was limited to moderate to strong liberal respondents and was not found in some countries. So basically, social mobility beliefs do connect to people's willingness to take action on economic issues, but the connection to specific policies is far from one-to-one. I should also say that a belief in individual mobility is not all bad. For example, a belief in social mobility may help motivate someone to take actions to improve their lot in life. And these actions can sometimes be helpful for the individual, even if they take place within an unfair system. In addition, feeling like you as an individual can't progress at all is just a shitty feeling. I think the hard thing is finding the right balance between one's individual responsibility and the need for collective action in an unfair society. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people willing to take advantage of that tension for their own ends. A lot of people are also willing to take advantage of social creativity in encouraging oppressed groups to compare themselves to groups with equal or lesser standing. This also divides those groups and keeps them from standing in solidarity against oppression and for a better life for themselves. Basically, if someone wants to stop collective action, they want people as separated as possible. They want to separate individuals and groups from each other, or in the far more poetic words of Hadestown,
why build walls? Make folks walk single file. Divide and conquer's what it's called.
Let's start with making folks walk single file. Or how often false perceptions of individual social mobility undermine collective action. There's definitely a reason that multi-level marketing schemes talk about being your own boss and taking control of your life. And there's definitely also a reason they heavily target women and other people marginalized from the mainstream business world. I can't prove that the reason that corporations and to some extent even governments and political parties push individualistic girl boss feminism is that it's less challenging to the status quo. But this sort of quote-unquote feminism focused on individual advancement within the existing system does not really seem to be creating a lot of systemic change. And we do see over and over that women can exploit others in a very similar way to the way that they are exploited by men. I'm certainly not arguing for womanhood to be ignored as an identity for organizing around. What I'm instead saying is that working for your own individual advancement as a woman is not the same thing as fighting for women as a group or dismantling the patriarchy. Having more women in positions of power, if those women are committed to women's rights, is good, but that is more being a leader within collective action than it is individual social mobility. I should also say that women and other people from marginalized groups trying to get ahead as individuals is not bad, it's just maybe not the route to systemic change. In addition, this sort of individual mobility can be tied to tokenism. Tokenism is when some limited number of people from a disadvantaged group can pass through societal barriers, but those barriers still exist. Obviously, the main problem with tokenism is that these barriers exist. But there is also the problem that tokenism makes it much harder to detect and overcome these mostly, but not totally impermeable barriers. Tokenism is likely to decrease collective action because it makes it harder to see the necessity of it. Like in Hadestown, how Hades lets Orpheus try to leave so that his workers do not realize the full extent of their own oppression and overthrow Hades. The good news is that in a series of experiments on tokenism, Wright found some ways to encourage collective action in spite of tokenism. If it is made clear that the tokenism is illegitimate, then collective action is more likely to occur. In other words, if people actually understand that more people from their group deserve something than are allowed to get it, they are more likely to act. In addition, if someone from the dominant group points out that the tokenism system is illegitimate and unjust, that is also likely to increase collective action. This over-individualized perspective also extends to messaging about the environment. I should mention that extending social identity theory to something like environmental issues is still valid because values and political inclinations can be an identity. However, social identity theory may not translate as smoothly to issues like climate change that affect everyone. Maybe the fact that climate change affects everyone is part of why efforts to make us conceptualize the issue individually have been so successful. The concept of the personal carbon footprint was invented by PR people from BP. Yes, British Petroleum. BP understood that we are unable to stand up to systemic issues like climate change as individuals. Before BP used this idea, messaging about littering was coming from the companies that made the sort of packaging people littered. These big polluting companies want to blame us for their unsustainable practices. My mom always says fix the problem, not the blame. But here, big companies are trying to fix the blame on us, so we can't fix the problem. Your personal consumption habits simply cannot end climate change. I went to a climate change protest a few months ago that was focused around getting the Federal Reserve to enact necessary environmental policies, like ending financing of fossil fuels and encouraging the financing of sustainable organizations and businesses. At the protest, I got into a conversation with a woman who was mad that some teenagers attending the protest had brought along a wagon full of snacks and drinks in plastic packaging. I should clarify, she was not angry at the companies that have forced plastic to be so pervasive in our lives, or at the government for failing to sufficiently regulate packaging. She was mad at these teenagers who had shown up in the rain to a climate protest and had been nice enough to bring snacks. Now, I'm not going to say that this was all that woman's fault, but she was certainly doing what fossil fuel and plastic companies would like her to do in that scenario. Trying to live in a more sustainable way isn't bad. It just isn't enough and can be a distraction. We did not create our unsustainable lives. We were dropped into them. Our ability to make more sustainable choices is largely shaped by the system in which we live. In order to change those systems, we need to act as a group. For example, I don't drive, and I mostly take the bus to get around. In order to do that, I need the government to provide bus service. Which I should clarify, I still pay for, both per ride and via my taxes. Sometimes I take Lyft or Uber if I need to get somewhere quickly or somewhere the bus does not go. I don't really have much of a choice, but if I work with those around me to lobby for better bus service, maybe I can have that choice in the future. And here's the beautiful thing. If we make that choice sufficiently cheaper or easier, people who don't give a shit about the environment will take that choice too. To quote Bill McKibben,
let's assume generously that 5% of Americans are deeply concerned about climate change. Concerned enough that they will change all their light bulbs, scrimp and save to put a solar thermal hot water system on the roof, or really scrimp and save to put some photovoltaic electricity up there. Unplug all their vampire appliances when not in use, cut the number of car trips they make in half, and use a hybrid for the remaining journeys, buy only local food in season, use a clothesline to dry their clothes whenever the temperature tops 50 degrees. That's 1,016 pounds of carbon saved right there. Cut their air travel by 2/3 and learn to enjoy the pleasure of staycations. Take showers with an egg timer so that they don't stay under too long. 350 pounds of carbon, and do all the other things that every website recommends for reducing your carbon footprint. And then let's assume that they go buy offsets for the rest from a company like Native Energy, which will use the money to build windmills on Indian reservations. Okay, add it up, carry the one, here we go. Yes, the impact on the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is 0. Okay, not precisely 0. Every little bit helps.
I think that number might be more than 5% by now, but this article is from around 2008. The point still stands, though. The good news is 5% of people is more than enough for a political movement, and political movements can change the way everyone lives. Also, by changing the way everyone lives, I absolutely do not mean by making people's lives more dreary or more limited. A lot of things that make life more sustainable also make it better or healthier. A lot of this is about making the more sustainable choice systemically easier or better. And I think a lot of people would like more trees in their neighborhood or better train service, even if they aren't thinking of it in environmental terms. I also think it's important to mention that by shaping how non-environmentalists live, environmentalists are not taking away their freedom. In the absence of collective movements, power does not flow to all individuals, but rather to certain already powerful individuals and to corporations. We can take this power back, but we have to do it together. In addition to mass political movements, individual actions are also more impactful in social context. Like when someone puts up solar panels, their neighbor is more likely to do so. Basically, that peer pressure thing they warned you about in health class can be good, actually. Although, yet again, and I'm just thinking of this as I'm recording the video, it is really important not to focus too much on the individual actions of climate activists. And a lot of the time, people who are opposed to the environmental movement really want you to do that. One environmental activist taking one flight in coach does not negate their activism. Of course, a choice like solar panels is not available to or practical for everyone. For example, I live in an apartment and not on the top floor, so I have neither legal control over my dwelling or a roof. Hell, I don't even have access to recycling. And I'm luckier than a lot of others in terms of the choices open to me. Basically, we can sometimes make better individual choices and pressure others to do so, but we need to work collectively to make those choices open to more people, as well as cheaper and easier. Still, it's not really about individual choices. The choices open to us in our current system simply won't cut it. And even if we had more choices, that is not necessarily the best way to approach things. It's great if you can choose solar power for your house, and I'm all for making that an easier choice. But what's much better is having your whole city or country powered by sustainable energy. I think now we can see why Hades would make Orpheus and Eurydice walk single file out of the underworld if he wanted Orpheus to fail. Being or feeling alone weakens us, or to quote Hades referring to Orpheus and Eurydice,
Orpheus, the undersigned, shall not turn to look behind. She's out of sight, and he's out of his mind.
Okay, now that we've talked about making folks walk single file, let's talk about building walls between them. I want to clarify here, I am mostly talking about metaphorical walls, although this does have a relationship with certain real walls. Within the social identity framework that I'm talking about, there is a form of social creativity that involves comparison with groups of lower or equal social standing. These comparisons can decrease the likelihood of collective action and sometimes serve the interests of a group higher in a social hierarchy. In Hadestown, this can be seen in the way in which Hades encourages his workers to view those beyond the wall, calling them the enemy and equating them with poverty. He also encourages the workers to see themselves as luckier than those beyond the wall and to see him as benevolent. Here are some lyrics between Hades and the workers to illustrate what I mean.
Calls we have and they have not, my children, because they want what we have got.
Because we have and they have not, because they want what we have got. The enemy is poverty, and the wall keeps out the enemy. And we build the wall to keep us free, that's why we build the wall.
I can see a lot of examples of this specific form of social creativity leading to conflict between oppressed groups, often with one or more oppressed groups siding with the oppressor. There are a lot of historical and modern-day examples I could go into here, but I don't want this video to be too long, so I'm just going to focus on a few permutations of one example. So let's talk about how racism against African Americans has been used as a tool for keeping people from addressing economic inequality, even economic inequality between white people in America. Before I get into this, I do want to say that racism has clearly had much worse effects on African Americans than it has had on economically disadvantaged white people. It is in no way my intention here to make the fight against racism about white people. I also fully admit that white privilege is a thing that I mostly have. To clarify, I'm European Jewish, so I mostly get white privilege, but certain very specific types of racists don't think I'm white and also hate me. Anyway, back on topic. Basically, my main point here is by encouraging poorer white people to compare their status to African Americans, and by sowing division between these groups, richer white people have been able to keep both these groups in a more subordinate position. I am cribbing most of this from the work of Heather McGhee, and specifically a great NPR interview she did in 2021. So if you want to learn more, I will link that below. McGhee makes the point that in the South, before integration, a very small amount of rich white people held nearly all the power and wealth, and did not have to offer much of it to the other white people in the area to get their support. They just had to promise to maintain racial hierarchy. Essentially, they encouraged poorer whites to compare themselves to black people and to focus on staying above them, rather than to compare themselves to rich whites and try to actually better their lot in life via collective action. A very similar phenomenon can be seen in the Reagan era, with less wealthy white people being convinced to vote against programs that would help them on racist grounds. To quote McGhee,
what the right was able to say, the government's no longer on your side. It's on the side of these undeserving people of color, these people you've been taught to distrust and disdain. And so you should trust the market, right? Turn to the market, turn to individualism, turn to the wealthy for your, sense of identity and trust and your sense of how you're going to succeed in life, right? It's no longer going to be the New Deal universal benefits.
the right was able to persuade people to focus more on maintaining their place in an unjust hierarchy than working to dismantle that hierarchy. And that, to me at least, is tragic. Unfortunately, strategies like this persist today and meet with frequent success. For an example, look at discussions around healthcare or welfare in America.
It's a sad song. It's a sad tale. It's a tragedy.
Hadestown ends in tragedy, but I don't want this video to, so I want to tell you one of many inspiring stories about solidarity. This story is the basis for the 2014 movie Pride. Pride is about solidarity between striking Welsh miners and gay people in the 1980s. I first encountered it in a social psychology class I took in undergrad. Actually, I only got to see about half of it then because I had a scheduling conflict and then I got lost. I'm convinced that the psychology building at my old university was a maze on purpose, and they were using it to run experiments. Anyway, a while later I got to see the whole thing. I think I've now seen it about 3.5 times, partially because my husband is both a British leftist and an enormous sap, so it's one of his favorite movies. Anyway, spoilers for the movie that are actually spoilers for 80s British history. Basically, in the movie, and in reality, a bunch of gays and lesbians decided to support striking coal miners. To quote Mark Ashton, one of the founders of LGSM, Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners,
"One community should give solidarity to another. It is really illogical to say, I'm gay and I'm into defending the gay community, but I don't care about anything else."
In addition, a lot of LGSM members and those in mining communities felt camaraderie due to their shared mistreatment by the police, media, and government. The miner strikes were not really successful, but the solidarity formed during that time really helped out the gays and lesbians in the long term. To quote Jonathan Blake, an LGSM activist,
"With the South Wales miners at the 1985 Labour Party conference, we put gay rights on the agenda. The resulting equality resolution became the trajectory that would lead to civil partnerships and marriages. Then Yam didn't want anything to do with poofs, but Di Donovan put pressure on them. He was as good as his word."
It is really important to note that LGSM did not go into it thinking that they would personally get anything out of it. They were trying to help others and they were helped in return. Okay, so what's the point of this video? Well, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that togetherness and solidarity isn't wishy-washy hippie stuff, it's power. And to a large extent, you can prove that scientifically and with historical examples. Individually, we are small and weak and easily taken advantage of. That's why those opposed to systemic change on issues like inequality and climate change encourage us to think and act only as individuals. While we absolutely can be taken advantage of as parts of groups, forming groups and alliances between groups is a key way to improve things for ourselves and others, as well as the only way to affect things at scale. Thank you so much for watching. You can check out all my social media as well as my Patreon at the links below. The Patreon really does help the channel a lot, and there are some fun perks. If you liked it, feel free to like and subscribe, and please also hit the bell because sometimes YouTube doesn't tell you when I have new videos otherwise. If you have a political psychology question, you can send it to me over on Patreon or comment it below this video, and it might become the subject of a future video. I want to thank everyone who contributed their voices to this video. I'll link to their various projects below. And last but not least, I want to thank my patrons over on Patreon who only appear to be cats. One of my Patreon perks is getting your pet or a friend's pet into the video credits.